Courtesy of your hall is somewhat lessened of late, Theoden King.
He's not welcome.
I release you from the spell. Be gone.
Hey Exiles, Chronic Painless here. The Forbidden Sanctum League is almost upon us, and I'll have an update to my Blade Vortex League Starter build guide once the full patch notes are posted in a couple days. For this video, I wanted to do something a little different than usual. But rather than focusing on my particular build, I'm going to take a broader look at Blade Vortex itself, and really break it down. My main goal is to help newer players, or really anyone who hasn't played BV before, get an understanding of it, so they can decide if it sounds like a fun spell to build around. But even BV veterans might learn a thing or two, since Blade Vortex has some properties that can be a little unintuitive, and it's easy to overlook some crucial factors that make it truly pop off. So let's start at the foundation. What is Blade Vortex anyway? Blade Vortex, or BV, is a spell that creates an area of effect around your character for a short duration, inside of which enemies will take periodic hits of physical damage. The visual effect is somewhat misleading though, as the game isn't actually rendering a bunch of projectiles that are orbiting around you and damaging the monsters on contact. In the reality of the game's code, any enemy inside the area of effect and within line of sight, so it can't hit around corners or through walls, will take damage at each interval, regardless of how often the blades on screen appear to strike them. But in spite of the fact that it has a duration and a fixed damage interval, it still counts as a hit as opposed to damage over time, which of course are mechanically distinct from each other in Path of Exile. As a result, BV can trigger on-hit effects, benefit from added spell damage, and deal critical strikes. At the same time, it doesn't gain anything from modifiers to damage over time or damage over time multiplier. And let me say once again, despite dealing physical damage, BV is a spell, and modifiers to attack speed, attack damage, or attacks in general will not affect it. Casting the spell just once creates the damaging area, represented by the blades orbiting your character and the icon on your buff bar. Additional casts will stack more blades, increasing the density of the visual effect and the count displayed on the buff icon. But unlike buffs such as power charges or inspiration charges, whose duration refreshes with each newly added BV stack, BV's blades fall off individually when their particular duration expires. Exiles can stack up to 10 blades, and the effectiveness of the spell scales exponentially as the stacks increase. This is the case because not only does each blade make you hit more often, it also makes you hit for more damage, and with increased chance of a critical strike. As a result, DPS output with 10 blades active will be almost 3 times what it is with 5 blades, and over 20 times what it is with just 1 blade. This extreme potency at maximum blades is why nearly all Blade Vortex builds in the modern PoE era make use of Unleash support, to the point that you can't really talk about BV without talking about Unleash. Unleash support generates seals at a set interval, displaying the current count on the spell icon in your casting bar. These seals will be consumed when the supported spell is cast, creating a repeat of the spell for each seal in addition to the original casting. This means casters can gain the benefit of casting a spell multiple times while only having to actually stop to cast once every few seconds. The power of this is balanced for most spells by the damage penalty imposed on the repeated cast. But Blade Vortex's unique functionality allows it to simply ignore that downside. Unleash is also ideal for BV since the number of hits per second is determined only by your current stack count and can't be scaled by investing in faster cast speed. As long as you are consistently creating 10 blades during the spell's duration, you are doing maximum damage, and more casting literally won't do anything. I talk more about how I try to personally optimize this interaction in the guides for my cold conversion build, but suffice to say, Blade Vortex and Unleash go together like cereal and milk. The last aspect of BV that's worth understanding if you're going to be blasting with it is how it scales its damage. Crucially, Blade Vortex has an added damage effectiveness of just 30%, meaning that modifiers that read adds 10 to 20 physical damage to spells only add 3 to 6 damage to the calculation of the spell's base damage. Fortunately, BV can scale its base damage incredibly well through gem levels, increasing exponentially all the way up through gem level 30. It also has a built-in 350% more damage multiplier with 10 blades active, creating an extremely strong foundation for stacking other sources of more damage. Of course, most spells prefer more damage over increased damage over flat damage, but for BV, the contrast between more and added is about as big as it gets. So all in all, that's Blade Vortex, a spell that creates stacks of blades, dealing physical damage hits in an area around the caster, periodically over a duration. And while there are tons of viable BV builds with a wide spectrum of strengths and weaknesses, they all have two primary ones in common. Most notably, the biggest strength of any BV build comes from its ability to output damage while the caster is moving. In a sense, Blade Vortex is a sort of pseudo-damage over time, where the hits keep coming, despite Exiles only having to cast once every couple of seconds. Compared to true self-cast spells like Lightning Conduit or attacks like Kinetic Blast, Blade Vortex can do its full DPS with 100% uptime without forcing you to stand still and face tank everything. At least it can in theory, but in practice, this can be made more difficult by the biggest weakness of BV, one that all builds must contend with: its limited range. The inability of BV to off-screen enemies is certainly the biggest knock against it as a spell. Difficult endgame encounters put heavy restrictions on where players can safely put themselves, even if they're constantly moving. So despite the fact that BV enables you to deal damage while staying on the move, sometimes it's simply not possible to do so while remaining close enough to that enemy to keep hitting them. Being subject to this difficulty is why Exiles often joke that BV is a melee skill, and to be honest, that's a pretty fair roasting. Fortunately, Vaal Blade Vortex, which creates an independently moving circle of death that can be placed wherever the caster chooses, helps immensely to shore up this weakness. It's particularly effective for mapping, but it can only do so much for you against pinnacle bosses and the like. Still, Vaal BV is an invaluable part of any good Blade Vortex, providing safety, clear speed, or a big burst of damage in the right situation. I recommend BV to anyone who is considering or has enjoyed skills like Cyclone, Winter Orb, or Righteous Fire. It has a very similar just run around while things explode vibe, which is hard to beat for both casual purposes or hardcore grinding. It's hard to say who I would not recommend this spell to, especially since there's such a wide variety of ways to make it work, from gigatanks to face-melting glass cannons to hyper zoomers and everything in between. Blade Vortex is a spell that can do it all. It's not often thought of as a league starter, but I've found a way to make it work with my cold conversion elementalist/occultist. If you're curious about the build, I definitely recommend checking out my older videos, and I'll be back soon with the patch 3.20 update. I'll also be streaming my league start on Twitch, and you can join the Discord for even more BV discussion. And as always, stay bam.